The concept of transaction brokerage for the national portion of the real estate exam centers on the understanding that a licensee can function as a non-agent who assists both a buyer and a seller without representing the specific interests of either party. This role is fundamentally different from a traditional agency relationship because the transaction broker does not owe fiduciary duties such as undivided loyalty or obedience to either side. On the exam, you will often see this role described using terms like facilitator or coordinator or simply a non-agent. The core responsibility of a transaction broker is to move the transaction toward a successful closing by handling the necessary paperwork and performing ministerial acts, which are routine tasks that do not require the exercise of professional judgment or advocacy. In many exam scenarios, you will be asked to identify the level of service provided in this relationship, and you must remember that it is limited to providing information rather than advice. One of the most common traps on the national exam involves the confusion between a transaction broker and a dual agent. While a dual agent attempts to represent both parties and still maintain some level of fiduciary responsibility, a transaction broker steps out of the representation role entirely. They do not represent anyone. This means they cannot advocate for the seller to get a higher price or for the buyer to get a lower price. They are often compared to a neutral referee in a sports game who ensures that the rules of the game are followed and the score is kept accurately, but does not care which team actually wins. A key testing point involves the duties that a transaction broker still maintains despite not being an agent. Even though they have no fiduciary obligations, they are still legally required to treat both the buyer and the seller with honesty and fairness, and they must perform the duty of accounting for all funds entrusted to them, such as earnest money deposits. Most importantly, they must disclose all known material facts regarding the physical condition of the property. Exam questions frequently try to trick students into thinking that because there is no agency relationship, there is no duty to disclose property defects. This is false, as the legal requirement to disclose latent defects or material facts that could affect the value of the property remains regardless of the agency status. However, the transaction broker must remain strictly neutral regarding confidential information. They cannot disclose a party's motivation for selling or buying or their willingness to accept different terms unless authorized in writing. A helpful mental shortcut for this concept is to think of the acronym TBA, which stands for Transaction Brokerage is Always Neutral. This helps you remember that neutrality is the defining characteristic of this role. On the exam, if you see a scenario where a broker is providing a buyer with a list of comparable sales but refuses to suggest what the buyer should offer based on those sales, you are looking at a transaction broker. They provide the data but let the party make their own decisions. Another indicator is the use of the word customer instead of client. In a transaction brokerage, the parties are customers who are being assisted rather than clients who are being represented. Understanding this distinction is vital because the exam will test your ability to recognize when a broker has exceeded their authority and accidentally created an implied agency relationship by offering advice or advocacy. Staying within the bounds of limited services and neutrality is the hallmark of the transaction broker.